In 634 AD, the inhabitants of Damascus beheld from their walls the return of the Muslims. A van of 9,000 horse, the bands of the Muslims succeeded each other in formidable review, and the rear was closed by Khalid in person, with the standard of the Black Eagle, with 2,000 cavalry patrolling the city, scourging the plains, and intercepting all support or intelligence. The rest of the Arabian chiefs were fixed in their respective stations before the seven gates of Damascus, and the siege was renewed with fresh vigor and confidence. The art, the labor, the military engines of the Greeks or Romans are seldom to be found in the simple, though successful operations of the Moslems. It was sufficient for them to invest a city with arms rather than with trenches, to repel the allies of the besieged, to attempt a stratagem or an assault, or to expect the progress of famine and discontent. Damascus would have surrendered earlier, but her courage was rekindled by the example and authority of Thomas, a noble Greek, illustrious in a private condition by the allegiance of Heraclius. The tumult and illumination of the night proclaimed the design of a morning sally, and the Christian hero, who affected to despise the enthusiasm of the Arabs, employed the resource of a similar superstition. At the principal gate, in the sight of both armies, a lofty crucifix was erected. The bishop, with his clergy, accompanied the march, and laid a volume of the New Testament before the image of Jesus, and the contending parties were scandalized or edified by a prayer that the Son of God would defend his servants and vindicate his truth.
The battle raged with incessant fury, and the dexterity of Thomas, an incomparable archer, was fatal to the boldest Saracens, till their death was revenged by a female heroine.
The wife of Aban, who had followed him to the holy war, embraced her expiring husband. The intrepid widow of Aban sought the place where his murderer fought in the thickest of battle. Her first arrow pierced the hand of his standard bearer, the second wounded Thomas in the eye, and the fainting Christians no longer beheld their ensign or their leader. Yet the generous champion of Damascus refused to withdraw to his palace. His wound was dressed on the rampart. The fight was continued till the evening, and the Saracens rested on their arms. In the silence of the night, the signal was given by a stroke on a great bell. The gates were thrown open, and each gate discharged an impetuous column on the sleeping camp of the Moslems. The valor and victory of Thomas were attested by the presence of the sword of God. With the knowledge of the peril, the Moslems recovered their ranks and charged the assailants in the flank and rear. After the loss of thousands, the Christian general retreated with a sign of despair, and the pursuit of the Moslems were checked by the military engines of the rampart.
After a siege of 70 days, the patience and perhaps the provisions of the Damascenes were exhausted, and the bravest of their chiefs submitted to the hardest dictates of necessity. In the occurrences of peace and war, they had been taught to dread the fierceness of Khalid, and to revere the mild virtues of Abu Ubaidah. At the hour of midnight, 100 chosen deputies of the clergy and people were introduced to the tent of that venerable commander. He received and dismissed them with courtesy. They returned with a written agreement, on the faith of the companion of Muhammad, that all hostilities should cease, that the voluntary emigrants might depart in safety as much as they could carry away their effects, and that the tributary subjects of the Caliph should enjoy their lands and houses, with the use and possession of 7 churches. On these terms the most respectable hostages, and the gate nearest to his camp, were delivered into his hands. His soldiers imitated the moderation of their chief, and he enjoyed the submissive gratitude of a people whom he had rescued from destruction. But the success of the treaty had relaxed their vigilance, and at the same moment the opposite quarter of the city was betrayed and taken by assault. A party of 100 Arabs had opened the eastern gate to a more exonerable foe. "No quarter," cried the rapacious and sanguinary Khalid, "no quarter to the enemies of the Lord." His trumpet sounded, and a torrent of Christian blood was poured down the streets of Damascus. When he reached the church of St. Mary, he was astonished and provoked by a peaceful aspect of his companions, their swords in the scabbards, and they were surrounded by a multitude of priests and monks. Abu Ubaidah saluted the general. "God," he said, "has delivered the city into my hands by way of surrender, and has saved the believers the trouble of fighting." "And am I not," replied the indignant Khalid, "am I not the lieutenant of the commander of the faithful? Have I not taken the city by storm? The unbelievers shall perish by the sword. Fall on." The hungry and cruel Arabs would have obeyed the welcome command, and Damascus was lost. if the benevolence of Abu Ubaidah had not been supported by a decent and dignified firmness. Throwing himself between the trembling citizens and the most eager of the barbarians, he adjured them, by the holy name of God, to respect his promise, to suspend their fury, and to wait the determination of their chiefs. The chiefs retired to the church of St. Mary. After vehement debate, Khalid submitted in some measure to the reason and authority of their colleagues, who urged the sanctity of a covenant, the advantage as well as the honor which the Muslims would derive from the punctual performance of their word, and the obstinate resistance which they must encounter from the distrust and despair of the rest of the Syrian cities. It was agreed that the sword should be seized, that the part of Damascus which had surrendered to Abu Ubaidah should be immediately entitled to the benefit of his capitulation, and that the final decision should be referred to the justice and wisdom of the Caliph. A large majority of the people accepted the terms of toleration and tribute, but the valiant Thomas and the freeborn patriots who fought under his banner embraced the alternative of poverty and exile. The adjacent meadow, a numerous encampment which formed of priests and laymen, of soldiers and citizens, of women and children, they collected, with haste and terror, their most precious movables, and abandoned, with loud lamentations or silent anguish, their native homes, and the pleasant banks of the Farpar. The inflexible soul of Khalid was not touched by the spectacle of their distress. He disputed with the Damascus the property of the magazine of corn, endeavored to exclude the garrison from the benefit of the treaty, consented with reluctance that each of the fugitives should arm himself with a sword or a lance or a bow, and sternly declared that after the respite of 3 days they might be pursued and treated as the enemy of the Muslims. 4 days was Khalid confined to the city by the obligation of the treaty and the urgent cares of his new conquest. His appetite for blood and rapine would have been extinguished by the hopeless capitulation of time and distance, but he listened to the persistence of Jonas, a traitor who assured him that the weary fugitives yet might be overtaken. At the head of 4,000 horse, in the disguise of Christian Arabs, Khalid undertook the pursuit. They halted only for the moments of prayer, and their guide had a perfect knowledge of the country. For a long way the footsteps of the Damascus were plain and conspicuous. They vanished on a sudden, but the Muslims were comforted by the assurance that the caravan had turned aside into the mountains, and must speedily fall into their hands. From a peasant in the country, they were informed that the emperor had sent orders to the colony of exiles to pursue without delay the road of the sea-coast and of Constantinople, apprehensive, perhaps, that the soldiers and people of Antioch might be discouraged by the sight and the story of their suffering. With the dawn of day, the prospect again cleared, and the Muslims saw before them, in a pleasant valley, the tents of Damascus. After a short interval of repose and prayer, Khalid divided his cavalry into 4 squadrons. They successively rushed on the promiscuous multitude, insufficiently provided with arms, and already vanquished with sorrow and fatigue. Except the captive, who was pardoned and dismissed, the Arabs enjoyed the satisfaction of believing that not a Christian of either sex escaped the edge of their swords. That ended the siege and fight for Damascus, with the tracking down and murder of the fugitives, with which a treaty was agreed to.